Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the absolute epic 65-year journey of what is, without a doubt, the world's most recognizable car. We're talking about the Volkswagen Beetle. With over 21 million units produced, this isn't just a story about engineering, it's a massive cultural phenomenon that literally reshaped the automotive landscape forever. Think about this for a second. How exactly did a controversial people's car project, one born in the darkest era of 1930s Germany and later completely rejected by established automakers, somehow manage to transform into the ultimate global symbol of 1960s peace, love, and freedom? How did it become the best-selling single-platform car in human history? It is an underdog story unlike any other. So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the origins of the people's car in the 1930s, trace its unlikely rise from post-World War II ruins, and watch it conquer the global market. Finally, we'll explore its peak as a cultural icon, and wrap up with the final chapter of its production. All right, part one, the origins of the people's car in the 1930s. The mandate for this car was actually laid out back in 1934 by Adolf Hitler. The goal was to build a people's car, something affordable, simple, and mass-produced to take advantage of Germany's brand new road network. The design brief was incredibly strict. It had to be an air-cooled car that could comfortably carry 2 adults and 3 children, all while burning under 7 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. Ferdinand Porsche snagged the official development contract, and by 1938, the massive Wolfsburg factory opened its doors. But then, World War II interrupted the whole shebang. Only 210 civilian models were produced before the factory was forced to shift entirely to military vehicles, like the rugged Kübelwagen. This went on until 1945, when the heavily bombed, practically ruined factory fell under the control of the British occupation forces. Now, here's something you don't hear every day. The actual origins of the car's iconic design are heavily disputed. Yes, Ferdinand Porsche was officially contracted and gets most of the credit, but he wasn't the only visionary playing with these ideas. An engineer named Bela Barini actually conceived a very similar rear-engine, rounded shape way back in 1925. A court even affirmed his authorship of the concept in 1953. And it doesn't stop there. Hans Ledwinka designed cars for Tatra with incredibly similar specs, which eventually led to Volkswagen paying a 1 million mark settlement in 1965. Moving right along to Chapter 2, Rising from the Ruins and Post-WW2 Recovery. So, the post-World War II era was looking incredibly bleak for Volkswagen. The Wolfsburg factory was so heavily damaged from bombing raids that the workers were literally dodging falling bricks. They could only build cars on sunny days because, well, the roof was missing. The whole place was actually slated to be dismantled. Enter British Major Ivan Hurst. He took control of this ruined factory and made a brilliant, completely pragmatic decision. Realizing there was a desperate need for both local civilian jobs and basic ground transport for the British Army, Hurst somehow managed to secure an order for 20,000 cars. He essentially restarted the factory purely out of sheer necessity. Okay, get this. What happens next is probably the greatest underdog moment in automotive history. In 1948, the British actually offered to hand over the entire Wolfsburg factory to the Ford Motor Company for absolutely free. But Ford's chairman of the board, Ernest Breech, took one look at the Beetle and told Henry Ford II that the car was fundamentally unattractive to the average buyer and totally uneconomic to build. Think about that. Ford passed on a free factory and what would soon become the best-selling car in history. No way, right? With the Americans totally out of the picture, control was handed over to a former Opel executive named Heinz Nordhoff. Nordhoff looked at the situation and realized that while they were selling cars domestically in Germany, the German currency was weak. If he wanted to buy the necessary machinery to really scale up the factory, he desperately needed foreign dollars. So he aggressively pivoted the company's entire focus toward international exports. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Conquering the Global Market in the 1950s. Nordhoff's big export push naturally targeted the United States, and honestly, it started incredibly small. An importer named Max Hoffman sold just 330 Beetles in America in 1950, but it was a foot in the door. To win over the broader market, the Beetle leaned heavily on an absolute masterpiece of simple, practical engineering. It had a highly reliable, air-cooled 4-cylinder boxer engine, which meant no radiator to freeze up in the winter. Its rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout gave it fantastic traction, even in the snow.
Add in that iconic aerodynamic curve, independent suspension for really nimble handling, and incredibly cheap, uncomplicated maintenance, you had a wonderfully practical machine that just made sense.
To put this into perspective, think about what American automakers were building in the 1950s and 60s. They were churning out these massive, fuel-thirsty land yachts covered in chrome fins and boasting huge V8 engines. Against that backdrop, the Beetle stood out perfectly. It was compact, modest, highly efficient, and it naturally positioned itself as a sensible alternative to the whole bigger is better mindset of the era.
Part 4. Becoming a cultural icon through the 1960s and 70s. The Beetle didn't just sell well, it's fundamentally transcended being just a mode of transportation. It became a global phenomenon. During the 1960s, it perfectly resonated with the rising anti-materialist counterculture. It really became the symbol of power to the people, freedom. You saw them everywhere, covered in peace signs at Woodstock or loaded up with surfboards on the beaches of California. Plus, its easily removable body meant enthusiasts could strip it down, bolt lightweight fiberglass shells right onto the chassis, and boom, you have the legendary Myers-Manx dune buggy, or those rugged off-road Baja bugs. It even conquered Hollywood, starring as a lovable, self-aware race car named Herbie in Disney's 1968 classic, The Love Bug.
All of this incredible cultural momentum culminated on February 17, 1972. On that day, the Wolfsburg factory produced this exact number of Beetles, 15,007,034. Now, why is that specific, random-sounding number so important? Because with that exact car, the Volkswagen Beetle officially surpassed the Ford Model T to become the single best-selling car in human history. Chapter 5. The final chapter. Because as we know, the wheel of history never stops turning, and the automotive industry was finally getting ready to leave the original bug behind. See, the Beetle's famous resistance to design changes eventually started working against it. By the 1970s, it was going head-to-head with far more modern competitors. Cars like the Honda Civic and even Volkswagen's very own Golf were rolling out with front-wheel drive and water-cooled engines. They offered way better fuel economy, more passenger room, and greater cargo space. Because of this, combined with stricter safety and emissions regulations, U.S. sales of the original Beetle officially ended in 1979. But wait, the bug wasn't entirely dead yet. It actually found a massive second life down in Latin America, where it continued production for decades. It especially thrived as the official taxi of Mexico City. But the final nail in the coffin arrived via legislation. In 2002, a new Mexico City law mandated that all operating taxis must have 4 doors for passenger safety. Practically overnight, this wiped out the viability of the classic two-door Beetle in its largest remaining market. And so we finally reached this staggering, absolutely mind-blowing production total, 21,529,464. The very last original Beetle, which was part of a 3,000-unit Ultima Edition run featuring white wall tires and that classic retro chrome trim, rolled off the assembly line in Puebla, Mexico on July 30, 2003, exactly 65 years after the first prototypes.
Now, Volkswagen definitely capitalized on the nostalgia later on, launching successful front-wheel drive retro revivals of the Beetle in 1998 and again in 2011, before finally retiring the nameplate completely in 2019. But here's the cool part. Its brilliant engineering spirit, that low center of gravity and the rear engine layout, actually lives on today. It heavily inspired the architecture of modern Volkswagen electric vehicles like the ID.4 SUV and the ID. Buzz microbus.
Which kind of leaves us with this final thought. The Volkswagen Beetle outlived the empire that commissioned it, completely defied the industry experts who literally said it was worthless, and connected millions of drivers across the globe for over 6 decades. Looking at today's highly fragmented and rapidly changing automotive market, you really have to wonder, will we ever see a single car unify the world quite like this ever again? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope you found it as fascinating as I did.